Try to do it this way to keep from screwing up my tie.
This is Jerry Barrett talking. Today's date is May 14th, 1986. I'm interviewing Jack Johnson, who's the Senior Vice President, Human Resources at Eastern Airlines. The interview is taking place in Eastern Airlines headquarters in Miami. Jack, could you start by just talking a little bit about what you did before you arrived at Eastern by way of experience?
Yeah. Before coming to Eastern, I'd worked for 23 years with one corporation, B.F. Goodrich Company. Started there right out of college and was part of a training program for production management, which led me into industrial engineering, which then led into labor relations. A big part of the labor agreement at Goodrich was involved the restrictions and rules that applied to setting incentive standards. So as a result of that, people who did that kind of work usually had an interest in labor as well. And from that had a series of personnel assignments in outside plants. Moved 5 times in 7 years, as a matter of fact, from one plant to the other. And then came back into a divisional job with the tire division and then a corporate job, and eventually became their vice president of labor relations and had the bargaining responsibility for the master contract, and in fact bargained the master contract on behalf of the industry in 1982. After that, I had gone to a special program at MIT, their program for senior executives, and which was a 9-week program, and came back to that and started into a general management type of job, and at about that time was also recruited by Eastern Airlines to come and head up their labor relations and their ground employees only, and try to establish a better bargaining climate with the machinist, and that was in October of 1983. I had talked at some length with Eastern about the job, had not really been interested in it initially, but because of the challenges and what was going on here, accepted the job. So came to work in October of '83 as the vice president of labor relations for ground employees, which meant I dealt principally with the IAM, and then following that, at the end of the year, was made vice president of human resources when Marv Amos elected to retire, and then went on and was eventually made senior vice president of human resources. So that's a very quick sketch of where I came from and where I am.
In that several month period there before you came to your current position with Eastern, Amos was still here, and did you report to him? Is that how?
Yes, I reported to Marv Amos.
That was a sub part of the human resource.
The organization at that time was divided into labor relations and personnel. Okay. And it was not an accident that the vice president of personnel was at one end of the hall and the vice president of labor relations was at the other end of the hall, because they literally did not meet on any issues. The vice president of personnel was responsible for the non-contract employees and, generally speaking, salary administration and wage administration for the non-contract employees. Employee benefits, per se, even though a traditional human resource function, employee benefits from a medical standpoint was the responsibility of the finance organization, and from a pension standpoint, the responsibility of the finance organization. So the human resource department at Eastern really was kind of maybe common for the industry, but strange for industry in general, in that there was a heavy concentration on personnel relations as a separate function, different from labor relations, a concentration on labor relations. The labor relations person in the in-flight operation, that is for the flight attendants, did not report to the human resource department, or the employee relations department as it was named at the time. the labor relations person for the flight ops for the pilots did not report to the human resource function, nor did, as I said, healthcare, the health insurance organization, nor the pension organization. And it turned out a strange thing. Some other organizations that did report was about a 200 or 300 person secretarial pool administrative service. And
That's peculiar too, isn't
it is. The job was more administrative and took advantage of Marv Amos's administrative talents as much as it did his human resource knowledge.
Can you briefly just describe how it is now? Because I understand that the pilots still do not.
The pilots do not report to the Human Resource Organization. That came about in a strange way. Initially, and I think as part of Bill Usry's advice, initially when I went over and took over the whole function, then we combined all of them. So the pilots did report, the pilot labor relations reported, and incidentally it was labor relations. The employee relations function just kind of falls in a crack there. So if you view that side of it, the focus for the employee relations person in the flight operations was always on labor. So it was always on the contract, and I'm not sure who literally picked up the slack in the other areas. But that came over and reported to me. The flight attendant operation came over and reported to me. At the same time, I picked up I picked up the healthcare side. So insurance group then started reporting to me, but not the pension group. Today, the pension remains a separate function remains a separate group reporting to finance, probably because of the trust aspect and the investment. So it's viewed more as an investment exercise than a pension benefit exercise. Shortly after that change, then the other changes I made was to try to do away with the notion that you had a personnel group who had responsibility for employee relations with the non-contract people, and went to a setup where basically we had a three-pronged deal. I viewed field employee relations people as having responsibility for all employees, not just those who had a labor contract. And they reported up on one side to John McDonald, who had field employee relations. The other piece of it was to have what I would call a delivery system, and that is to have health benefits administration reporting to one person, as well as the medical department and the administrative group, the secretarial pool. So they became the method by which we kept our promises, as I characterized it. You know, we told people we'd have health care, that we'd have employee assistance, that we would have a medical department, and then we also committed to people for administrative service. That became our keep your promise department. And then the other piece of it was to try to look forward and design new systems and so on, and that became the personnel planning group, who did training and who have ultimately developed the training responsibility plus salary administration and those kind of things. So they essentially became then the design group for personnel. So you had a field organization that was really your day-to-day operation. You had a group that kept in place all of the delivery systems, as I say, the healthcare coverage and so on, and then another group who did the planning, the forward planning. And it still remains basically that way today. We've changed some people around, but basically that's the concept, the organization concept. Shortly after that move, we were in negotiations with the pilots, and it's kind of an interesting anecdote in a sense, because it tells how pilot negotiations generally went here, and that is the chairman of the pilot negotiating committee came to Frank and said that they did not want, and this is the union representative saying to Frank Borman, they did not want the pilot negotiator, the company negotiator for the pilots, to report to someone who wasn't flight operations, and the change was made. So Al then went over and reported to the vice president of flight operations, who then, I think, at some point in time, I'm trying to recall when Shipner went into that job, but, well, I think it was at about the same time, maybe afterwards.
But that's sort of typical of the pilots to be tied in with the
yeah, that's right.
flight operations.
To be managed by pilots and to have their own operations, and I think longer term that's going to have to change. I think it would be my guess that under Texas Air that will revert to the point where all labor relations, for good or bad, will come under one organization.
Mm-hmm.
To me, it's just damn near impossible to have a consistent labor strategy if you're going to have different people doing different things. Mm-hmm. And it's not been, to tell the truth, it's not for lack of communication, but there are different axes to grind and different things to accomplish, and so it's very difficult to control that if it's going off in different directions. That's all.
How did Bill Usry was already on the scene when you arrived? How does he fit into this?
It was kind of strange because when I was once I said I would come to work for Eastern, and I kind of got a series of phone calls, and one of them was that we're going through a wage cut, 10% wage cut, but you'll be exempt from that. I said, fine. The one phone call I never really got was the one that said we were planning to file for bankruptcy. I found that out after I came. but
surprise.
But the one that the one I did get was from Marvin to say that, by the way, we've hired a Bill Usry as a labor consultant. Does that bother you? I said no, because one, I was very comfortable with Bill. I knew Bill I think I knew him better than he knew me, but the fact is that I first met Bill in rubber negotiations, and I think that was probably 1973 negotiations. Oh. And he was with, I think, the mediation service, and in rubber you tend to live your life 3 years in 3-year segments, so you always reference things as when the contract expired. But I think that was 73 negotiations, and then by 1976, Bill was Secretary of Labor. And and rubber had a 141-day strike, and so I knew Bill then. Bill thought he was going to be the guy to settle a strike on the 4th of July in a bicentennial year, and that just didn't work. But we subsequently settled, I think, in September, but got to know Bill during that period of time. So I had, and then Bill was considered and recruited to be a consultant in rubber bargaining in I think in '82. I'm trying to recall. Arnie Weber did that in '79, so it'd be in '82, and so our paths have crossed a lot. And Bill is a good person and a professional, and so the answer, long answer, but the fact is I was very comfortable with Bill around. But Bill was here when we first arrived. And Bill, of course, worked very hard to try to get. I think Bill had tried to do two things: protect me initially from the confrontation, so that while that was going on, figuring that longer term, my strength would be to deal to go through the turmoil of what ultimately became the 18% wage reduction, and then so to hack our way through that, but that my best put would be to try to establish some long-term positive labor management relations, and viewed that as my real mission.
Mm-hmm.
So Bill took a very, very strong, very, very active position, I should say, in that early negotiations, especially the piece where we made the deal for the 18%, where we mutually agreed to do whatever it took to fix the company. We settled the flight attendant negotiations. I was on the periphery of that. In fact, assigned asked Al Gibson to help with that because he had a little easier manner in dealing with in dealing on contract issues, and also Dwayne Andrews, who I replaced as the ground guy. And so they both, plus Roland, participated in early flight attendant negotiations. Then the next role in that was subsequently to meet with the flight attendants and try to modify their B-scale agreement, which once they agreed to it, were having a tough time living with it, so, which we subsequently did. And in the process got to know the pilots negotiating committee fairly well too. But initially my position was to try to work toward the longer term relationships and not necessarily get embroiled in this 18% deal. Then right after that deal was made, then we of course had to sit down with the IAM and work out some details of it, and I did that. So that's how I came into that. That's how Bill was involved initially, and it's our starting point together.
You really had to hit the ground running, though, because the company was right in the midst of things in the fall of 82.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, 83.
83, and this, of course, they were still living. I didn't know this, but and this might have been what drove them to seek to find a different way to deal with the machinist. And I think they viewed the machinist as their single toughest nut to crack, as the single biggest obstacle in bargaining, on and on ad nauseum. But they had to find a way to deal with that, and that was in part an outgrowth of an event that predated me, but it was in 1983. The company had convinced all other employees that they were willing to take the machinist on, that they were no longer going to suffer these outrageous demands and outrageously high settlements. They couldn't afford it, and we're going to settle with some moderation, and then in fact caved in at the last minute, facing a strike, and which caused a very, very adverse reaction on the part of all other employees. I mean, they were literally ready to go to war with the machinist, and that carried over then into our discussions with the mechanics or the machinist. But basically the atmosphere we came into was Borman was saying, either grant the concessions or we're going to file bankruptcy under Chapter 11, or file for protection under Chapter 11. And that was playing. Bill was running feverishly was working feverishly to try to avoid that, to get some kind of and of course using that as a pressure point too, as a bargaining point. And finally got an agreement with all three unions. One of the stipulations of that agreement was that we reach, as I mentioned earlier, reach agreement with the flight attendants. So that was basically the atmosphere, one of threatened bankruptcy, need for an 18% reduction. The other thing that had been done, I haven't mentioned, is that we had gone to the non-contract employees and asked them to vote as to whether they would take a 15% pay cut or not. What we wanted was 15% in wages and 5% in benefits or productivity. And they had agreed to do that in a kind of a referendum. And then that was set aside. But in the meantime, we had also selected what we called the Salaried Employees Committee, SEC. And I don't know really, I know what they were told, but they viewed their role as to be involved in this bargaining on behalf of the non-contract employees. Now there's a conflict in terms. I mean, we had a 10-man committee that was here to bargain with the company for people who didn't have a contract. And but so that was it really was a very hectic setting, because you had the flight attendant negotiating committee, the pilot negotiating committee, and the IAM, and the IAM had just recently negotiated a contract, so they weren't interested in doing a lot. The threat of bankruptcy, and a committee that had been seated for one mission that we really had to deal with in a different fashion, because obviously it didn't matter, in a sense. The real bargaining was going to have to take place with those who had contracts, and it really didn't. Maybe I'll just spend a couple of minutes talking about that committee, because it really was an interesting group. And what had happened is that my understanding is, in the process of going out and saying to non-contract employees, we need to make pay cuts, we need to make concessions on other things, and they said, well, we never get a say in this. So, you know, what we did was then give them a right to vote on it. And as you might expect, it was, you know, over 95% in favor of the pay cuts. And but then the thing that was agreed to is to put together a committee made up of representatives of agents and representatives of the res areas and so on. And this became a 10-man committee with a chairman. And as I said, really, in a sense, and that was designed, I think, in part by Marv and in part by John Nelson, who was then VP of personnel, and was designed to give a sense, I think, of involvement on the part of the non-contract people. They came then to the party honestly believing that they'd sit down and work out what they were willing to do or not willing to do, you know, whether for them it would be 18% or 15%, and then they were also told that if they could discover a way to save money, you know, for instance, if they could find a way to reduce expenses by 10% otherwise, then their pay cut would only be 10, which was just not a thing that anyone could live with, and was totally a distortion of what, I don't think they distorted it, I think we distorted it as a company.
It was pretty new ground. Everybody was on there, though.
Yeah.
So it was bound to be some confusion about the exact roles, I suppose.
Yeah, but I thought that, yeah, there was some confusion with that, but I think purely, maybe somewhat naively, they'd been given an assignment. The Salary Employees Committee had been given an assignment that no one could live with, and was a little bit misleading. But the thing is that they really did, there was a lot of anger in dealing with them initially. But what I started to say is they really did, in the final analysis, a superb job of representing the salary employees' opinion to management. They really, you could really say to them, how will this fly? You could say to them, this is what we're going to do and why, and it would get communicated very well, and they could tell you they could pretty well predict reactions. So they weren't there to represent in a collective bargaining process, but they did a fine job of representing the people, their feelings, their attitudes, their fears, everything else that goes with all the emotions that go with that kind of setting. And they were designed to sunset when all this was over with. I asked them to stay on because primarily at the time I wasn't satisfied with the progress that was being made in the employee involvement group with respect to having that become a forum for ideas and change and so on in the way we dealt with non-contract employees. And that,
At the time, that was supposed to cover non-contract employees as well? The
well,
employee
at the
involvement was?
time, employee involvement was, the idea of employee involvement was to change our culture from to. And from what was stated to be a very structured, militaristic kind of approach to running a business to one that was more employee participative and employee involved. And each group was represented in that organization. So the machinist came around. As a matter of fact, during my early days and on into '84 is where we signed off on all this stuff.
Okay, let's pause it.
Okay. I think, Jerry, the point I wanted to make is that really we had a very tough task ahead of us bargaining with the three unions at the same time. But then it just added to the difficulty with having yet another group who really were without portfolio in a sense, but yet were there to be reckoned with, and literally crying for attention. So it became a very interesting kind of exercise, because you'd sit sometimes to 2 and 3 in the morning bargaining with these union folks, and then go over and hear these salary employee committee representatives would be waiting. They were standing by just the same as if they were involved in direct bargaining. You go through and you take them through where you were so far and what it looked like and how they were going. And their patience in putting up with all that, and sometimes they weren't really patient. I've seen them come to tears, because as we finally decided what the pay reductions were, how we would treat the fact that there were pay increases built into some of these contracts, and what we intended to do with them, and really it worked out that we matched a pay increase. In fact, we increased slightly a pay increase we were going to give I think was due the IAM. It was like a 3.5% increase, and that got reflected as 3.7, and we moved it forward. What we really built into the budget for the non-contract people was, I think, a 5%. Later in the year, we moved it forward and made it 3.7 because of the travel time. But through all of that, they really stuck by us, and as I said, there was a lot of emotion, a lot of tears, because they thought that they would be more involved in bargaining. I mean, that they thought they were there to bargain and to represent their position, and that didn't happen at all, because they literally ended up, in a collective sense, it didn't happen, but in one sense it did, because we came to rely on them very heavily for what the salary employees were thinking, to tell us what the salary employees were thinking, and to help us communicate back what was going on. And they did that without animus. They did it without bias. They were very straightforward in talking to people. And it's kind of always been a pleasure to realize, and a joy to realize, that they subsequently, almost all of those people, have since been promoted to more important jobs. Not as a reward for the position they held and the fact that they served on that committee, but it's a reflection on the quality of the people who are on that committee. It really is turned out to be a source of satisfaction. The other thing that happened with that committee, just to bring closure to that, is they were, when this was all over with, it carried over into early '84, but when it was all said and done, there was to be a sunset on that committee. And because of the continued turmoil and knowing that we were going to face some problems at the end of the year, I asked them to stay on, and they did. They continued to meet on a regular basis and discuss important issues with respect to salaried employees. And in fact, stayed on through most of '85, if I remember correctly. So they became almost counsel to us on the salary employees. And it's probably one of the most effective groups I've ever worked with.
Is that?
Yeah.
That's most interesting.
Yeah, because they, and we don't see each other very much, but they became very much a part of the employee relations organizations inadvertently without knowing it.
Mhm.
Very, very effective group.
You mentioned earlier that you're interested in keeping them active, was that the employee involvement thing wasn't going too well. Can you talk a little bit about that?
There was, sure. At the same time, and there were a lot of activity going on simultaneously, we were trying to get employee involvement off the ground, and so each of these groups, the flight attendants, the non-contract people, the machinists, and the pilots, to a lesser extent, were working on a charter, so to speak. And I think the first people to develop one were the machinists, the mechanic, the IEM, and they came forward. And there were some things I disagreed with, but it was worked out that and I think the biggest area of disagreement was to whether there would be a gain sharing attached to the EI effort or not. That is to say, would we sit down and work out a program whereby people receive some benefit for their productivity improvements. And I disagreed with that because I thought it was counter to what we were trying to do at the time. But anyhow, we worked out an EI agreement, a contract literally between us and the machinist, and signed off on that. And the machinist, being very pragmatic folks, went right to work, and they put together several committees, small groups of problem-solving groups and study groups, and went right to work on the productivity issues, and in fact delivered well on their productivity commitment for 1984. And that was a feature of the wage reduction, was literally an 18% wage cut and a 5% improvement in productivity. And I don't think there's any question but what the IM delivered on that.
Mm-hmm.
The non-contract group were late in getting started, and it did not then become but ironically enough, it did not become the non-contract groups, and I'm talking about the EI steering committee group, so responsibility to deliver on, again, the 5% productivity improvement. And it was a salary employees committee that carried that through, marshaled all that through, gathered up the projects, listened to the ideas, and helped evaluate them during 1984.
Come in.
Incidentally, Jerry, are you going to talk to union people in the process?
Yeah, I am.
Okay.
Yeah, I do. Well, let me answer. I've talked to some people from the pilots already, and I'm going to catch the others as I can.
I bet Charlie was very curious about what was going on, and so I told him. I mean, he just said, and I says, just as if you wouldn't do a history of the war between the North and the South without talking to both sides. Yeah. I really don't think you intended to try to do this. Right. Good. Be interesting. Well, anyhow, back to this. Back to where the employee involvement thing was going with the non-contract people. They were spending a lot of time doing philosophical things and couldn't really settle down as to what their mission in life was. And then they decided that they wanted to become brokers of ideas. And I said, we're up to our ass in brokers. So the evolution of going from the concept of employee involvement, with the kind of grand scale ideas, and back on through into getting down to very practical kind of applications, to bring the knowledge of the job and focus the knowledge you as an individual have of the job on a problem. We just never really got to that at that stage. So it was the Salary Employees Committee who just, without any training whatsoever, picked up the ball and ran with it. And so they became, as I said, a very, very good group to deal with. Mm-hmm. Very important in the scheme of things.
Is that still the case as far as the employee involvement is concerned?
No. The employee involvement predates my coming to the acceptance of employee involvement. I think my observation has been at Eastern has been that anything worth doing is worth doing to excess. And so what happened when we first got into this, we gathered up hordes of people, apparently had a very healthy budget, sent a lot of people off to Boeing to talk to them and other places, and selected some people who were that had a very high academic bend, and had them establish this organization. The theory was that the purpose of EI was to change the culture at Eastern. I can buy that if the assumption is that the culture at Eastern was one of not listening to employees, so not having a great participatory environment, and that the need was to get to that. Mm-hmm. Ironically enough, though, I think the culture, and I mentioned it earlier, the culture at Eastern was one that we were very militaristic, and we needed to get away from that. So we were concentrating more on what we were trying to get away from as opposed to what we were trying to go to. And, there wasn't a lot of direction, and it also became a very free-form kind of organization, because it was kind of like, do what you want to do. Mm-hmm. And over time then, we replaced, just to digress, they had done a lot of research, had put a lot of structure to it, very complicated structure, were very, very slow. I mean, they were just not pushing at all, because they were afraid the IAM would rebel, and the IAM had already shot down quality circles as a concept, and that in part came, I think, from the International, who was saying, look, quality circles and employee involvement is the end of unionism, because employees are eventually going to have their own direct voice, and it's a plot to overthrow unions, and we finally put all that to rest. The fact is that the structure, the EI structure, was a very loose one, and was designed along the lines of what I would characterize as a shadow government. So I think the people who ran that viewed themselves as a mini corporation, and the idea was that you would laterally move the rest of the corporation in that direction, and that's how you would affect change. Looks good on a chart, just doesn't work. I mean, you just have to get down to very, if things are going to work. The people who work at Eastern have a very practical kind of nature to them, and especially the mechanics. And they wanted to see results, they wanted to see projects, they wanted to see them carried out. They wanted someone to listen to all the ideas they've had on how to restore pieces instead of throwing them away and buying new, and how to reconstruct or how to repair parts as opposed to replacing them, and those kind of things. So that's what they were interested in. And I have, again, as an aside, have been told by a number of people, I think we generally accept this, that 1984, for many, many people who bring a lot to the job and expect a lot from the job in the way of job satisfaction, that 1984 was the best year they've ever had here. And I'm talking about some 20-year employees, and especially in the mechanic ranks. Mm-hmm. Some of the agents felt the same way. And in these areas where we were doing working together kind of projects, and that was a theme that the union coined, but it was very much, it kind of captured the sense of what we were trying to do.
It was real, in the sense,
was real,
as far as they were.
Yeah. Now, the pilots never came into that, nor did the flight attendants, and they have not to this day. The pilots have, I think, honestly searched for where employee involvement can take them, but it's very difficult. They seldom work the same crews together. The size of the crew, how do you improve productivity of a group of people who are essentially captive in a cockpit or in the fuselage of a plane? So it's been difficult for them to find a way. But again, back to where this all started, the fact is the IAM people took off with the idea very quickly, and put work groups together and problem-solving groups together, and had some 50 groups organized in the Miami base. That has now dropped down to a smaller size. Can, I think, be revived again. The non-contract people spent a lot of time worrying about philosophical issues and never really could get down to solving the productivity problems that that group faced, and it was the Salary Employees Committee then who took that on. What eventually happened is we moved the head of the Employee Involvement Project out to another job, replaced him with someone who had a reputation for being pragmatic, and then slowly moved the whole thing into that direction. At the same time, which has just really been the latter part of, well, last year, I guess, but the latter part of last year, the salary the Salary Employees EI Steering Committee became much more active in projects, in cost savings and expense reductions and productivity improvement projects, and then moved into that kind of area. As they came into it, the Salary Employees Committee as an organization phased out.
Was able to
Yeah,
phase
it's
out.
probably the first time in history that the committee has had the sun set on it, literally. But they did, and it was by their own choice, and they were ready to go on to other things. They again, they were good people, solid individuals who did not believe in being on a committee just for the sake of being on a committee. And when it came time to move on to other things, they did. It was a good group.
Who is the chair of that committee?
Jerry Monda. They used to say that. It's Jerry, you really have. Jerry Monda works in Atlanta. He chaired the committee through the full 2-year life cycle, and very bright guy. And you ought to talk to him because he can give you. And there were some women on that committee who were very bright that might be worth your time.
Okay.
They were tough people. I mean, they didn't really. You didn't BS them at all. I mean, you had to have facts, but they were good, solid people.
I think I will try to track some of them down
Yeah.
at this
Yeah.
as well. What really happened to the IAM end of the employee involvement after '84?
Well, there's a claim. I guess I'm all alone in disbelieving this. There's a claim that Charlie shut down the employee involvement project when, in fact, we came to the end of '84 and did not return wages to the former 100% level, kept in the 18% deductions, and which led to the big rift between the company and the unions, the labor organizations. I think what had happened, in fact, and I tend to believe Charlie on this, and it might be a thing you want to ask him specifically about, but I honestly believe that what Charlie said is don't start any new projects. Continue to work on the ones you're on, but don't start any new projects. Now, he may be more sinister than I give him credit for, but I don't think so. And there are some who say that Charlie, that was just a very clever way of bringing an end to EI. What Charlie claims he did, in fact, was to say, look, when you start working on new projects, when you start working on new ideas, a lot of time is spent just sitting around talking about things, and there's the visibility is that you've got a bunch of people sitting around BSing, and I was not going to take that kind of criticism, and was not going to. I just didn't think it was healthy to have that going on at a time like this. I accept
there
that.
you're quoting Charlie.
Yes.
In what you just said. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and I accept that. I think that he was sincere in it. I think I'm probably the only person that does, but I believe that that's what he was doing.
The one other kind of form of employee involvement was the effort at getting more less supervision and more lead men. How does that all fit into the EI?
Well, that that really was more a part of the negotiations that surrounded the 18% reduction, because basically what the union, I think, from a philosophical standpoint, was saying to us, and more the IAM than anyone, because the IAM really led the initiative in those negotiations. Because what they were saying is, if we take an 18% pay cut and give you 5% in productivity, then there are certain assurances that we must have, and they take many forms, and one of those is that you'll run a more efficient business, and the other one, of course, is that there must be some kind of equity in the company, and therefore the ownership position, the 25% equity ownership position taken by the combined work groups. But they were also very sensitive to changing the way we did business, and they felt that we were overloaded with supervisors, with direct supervisors, and we agreed to improve the quality of our lead men, to increase the responsibility of the lead men, and to reduce the number of supervisors. And that was a thing we mutually agreed to do, as part of this bargain that was taking place on the 18%. Now, I think, that in this case that there probably was a dual purpose. I think a union was genuine in its feel that we have too many people supervising basically craftsmen who know what they're doing. But I think I think there was another reason too, and that in the past, when we were approaching any kind of labor problem, we would traditionally add great numbers of supervision or build up our supervisory levels, feeling we could maintain some level of operation during a work stoppage. So they really accomplished two things with that. One, they inhibited our ability to fly through a strike, but I think that just to say that was the only reason would be ingenuous. I think they really were interested also in reducing the number of direct supervisors. How effective having a lot of supervisors are during a strike is questionable. I think if you're really going to try to fly through a strike.
Okay, we're back on.
Okay. So but to give them their due, we never really did say that we were just going to come through and change overnight the supervisory to employee ratios. That we weren't interested in just waving a wand, and they weren't either. And so the commitment was one that lead men would then fulfill their responsibility to lead the activities of the people in their crew, and as we were able to make that transition, that we would then reduce the number of supervisors. So if reducing our ability to function during a strike was an effect, I think it was merely a side effect. I really think that their initial and primary goal was to reduce costs and to give mechanics a little more leeway in doing their job. Now, it was my impression, new at the time, that lead men spent most of their time either making coffee or reading newspapers, and it really was it had become a very cushy job. It was a place you wanted to go, and then of course there was always great pressure to increase the number of lead positions and to reduce the number of employees per lead, because that created better, higher paying jobs, which were, semi-retirement. That was my perception. I don't think that was far from the truth. So because we had a lot of discussion about leads then assuming their responsibility, and and maybe the perception of leads not working was in reality by actual count probably wasn't as great as I believed and other people believed, but obviously enough leads not doing anything other than, as I said, making coffee for the rest of the employees and reading newspapers, enough of that going on to taint the whole idea. Mm-hmm. Okay, I can remember, having those kind of conversations with Charlie in that committee, and Marty Ura, who at the time was president of the Miami local of the IAM, saying, well, wait a minute now. Well, Charlie's saying, first of all, look, the leads, will have to assume responsibility. And Marty Ura is saying, well, look, we'll give them a choice. If a lead doesn't really want to be what we call a strong lead, that is to take his crew, then he doesn't have to. And Charlie said, doesn't use these terms, but essentially horseshit. If we're going to make this deal, then the lead will do his job or he won't be a lead. So he made a very strong commitment in that sense that I think really went beyond rhetoric, because as it worked out, he delivered on that. So it was up to us to train the leads, and we set up good training programs, and a big part of that was, how do you manage people? Mm-hmm. And so I think at 84 we were really on the right track of doing all those things. And so we set up lead training programs. We put as many people as we could through. In the meantime, we started to phase out supervisors, give them a choice of moving back. Attrition was taking care of a lot of it. And we're moving them around, but putting the lead more and more in the fore and pulling a supervisor back to do less actual directing of the workforce and more planning and taking care of those support issues that have to do with the workforce. It was our idea, at the bargaining table, to do that on a planned and first on a pilot basis, then move into doing it. I think it was really at the company's initiative that was done on a much heavier, accelerated basis, and I think we got in trouble because of it, because we tended to give our leads more responsibility than they were trained to take, and not capable of taking, trained to take, and not deal with all the issues that came up. At least that's my point of view. Mm-hmm. Others would differ, but the fact is, at the bargaining table itself, the union is very strong on the issue of leads performing their job, and very strong on the issue of doing it in an orderly fashion. And if that fell apart, I think we share the blame for that. We then, after that, set off on an odyssey of visiting all the major stations, and Charlie and myself and Tom Bunchen was in a key operation job at that time. He was responsible for airlines operations on a day-to-day basis, and Don Martin in some cases, sometimes Russ Ray, but we all started the rounds. It was Charlie and I were at all those. Tom was at all of them. We all started the rounds of the stations to meet with groups of employees, to talk about the contract, to talk about working together, to talk about productivity, and to talk about leads performing their responsibility. And that was all very positive. And again, I think probably we're at our high point as far as bringing employees into the process and working together.
That was now in 84.
Yes, yes. So this is 83. We negotiated the wage investment program. 84, we implemented it, and we had basically a full, what we viewed as a full year to get this all back. Coming out of 84, it became obvious to us that that we were if we gave return wages to employees, that we'd be out of business. And in the meantime, we were back into contract negotiations with the IM because their contract expired at the end of '84. Now, forget the fact that their contract had just been negotiated in the spring of '83, but it was a year and a half in bargaining.
Yes.
So their 2-year agreement expired at the end of '84. And so we, near the end of 30 days, I think 60 days prior to November 1st, we started negotiating on a new contract, but initially really tried to negotiate an extension of the wage investment plan and the wage withholdings. There was a commitment on the part of all unions to meet 30 days prior to the end of 1984 to discuss those issues. And Charlie just stonewalled that problem. He just said, I'm not going to talk about it. All wages come back. And those meetings continued into, of course, the end of the year. Came the end of the year, we made a decision to continue to withhold the 18%, which is what we did through all of '85 for some groups. But we then negotiated a new contract with the IAM, and because again of the involvement of the bankers, we negotiated agreements with the pilots and the flight attendants. Those two agreements, ironically enough, fell apart, and
were not ratified.
Well, the one was not ratified. The other one ended in a lawsuit. The other one never was a contract. It was an interim deal until they bargained a new labor agreement with the pilots. That ended in a lawsuit. Pilots claiming they had the right to have all their money back. A feature of the IAM agreement that was negotiated in spring of '85 was to provide for pay increases over it. It was a 3-year agreement with pay increases over the 3 years. Pretty hefty increases: 6% in '86, 4% in January of '87, and 3% in July of '87. Plus the opportunity to earn back the reductions in pay that had taken place as a result of the 18%. So there was we developed a more formalized committee to identify and measure the benefit of cost reductions. We carried that forward into the non-contract group, but basically the thrust of that came from that came from the mechanics. And what the mechanics were saying is, look, we want a contract to provide some pay increase over time, but we also want the opportunity through productivity and cost savings to earn our 18% back. So you ended up with some strange combinations. You ended up with people getting pay increases that were then subsequently discounted by whatever the difference was between the 100% and where they were on the restoration of wages.
That's where that salary of record idea comes from.
Yeah. So I'd have to look at the numbers to recall specifically, Jerry, but it was ironically, the flight attendant's contract was rejected. The pilots sat down with it. See, the pilots had a total Me Too that said if the pilot deal only applies if everybody else comes to the table. The flight attendant's contract was rejected. We went back to the pilots and said, your deal is off, literally, but we'd like to talk to you about that. The pilots, it's been my experience since coming here that, call it what you will, the pilots have been absolutely scurrilous in their bargaining. I mean, I've never known them to keep their word except with one committee, and that was essentially the committee that negotiated the wage investment plan. that committee was pretty solid. And what they said they would do, they usually delivered on. But since then, I think we've changed committees 5 times. I've never known them to keep their word for more than 30 minutes, and never known them to bargain in a fashion that they literally did what they said they would do, that they didn't have some hidden agenda in the language. So, you know, it's been tough bargaining with them. Now, I would guess that they perceive us as bargaining the same way.
Mm-hmm.
That merely is what we consider offensive and offensive, as offensive bargaining and offensive in nature. They probably think as being defensive,
Mm-hmm.
and is the proper way to deal with the company. But they've been a grave disappointment, because you really can't sit down and openly discuss a contract issue in a problem-solving way. Machinists come closer to that than anyone. But so the pilots, in the spring of facing February and default of '85, the pilots came to the party, and the flight attendants came to the party, and I really don't recall who was there first. The fact is, we ended up that night at a deadline on default with everybody at the party except the IM. And what Charlie has said on several occasions, it's ironic that here he sits today at this time. This is before we finally settled with the pilots and the flight attendants. And that settlement didn't take place until February 23rd of this year, at the very last hour in the Lorenzo takeover thing. But Charlie has said, isn't it ironic that I was the guy that was told that I'm the only holdout, that I can't, and this is again in the spring of '85, that it's my fault that we're going into default, and here I stand, the only guy with a contract, and you guys are still trying to bargain. As I said, this was before the February 23rd of this year. So,
Do you agree with that irony? I mean, do you see?
I mean, irony is irony.
Yeah.
It really is ironic, but we have, not without good reason, we've chosen to blame the machinists for most of our problems. And I'm not sure that that's a totally fair indictment. They've been a lot tougher, but when it's done with them, and you go on to other things.
And it is when you do have a deal with them, you do have a deal with them.
you have a deal.
Yeah.
You have a deal. One of the things that happened then, I get off on this, but one of the things that happened, of course, is the flight attendants turned down their agreement, again, back to '85. And we said to the pilots, well, you guys are out of the deal. And he said, well, no, not necessarily. Let's sit down and talk about it. They were able to get something else from us. And in getting something else, they eliminated the flight attendant contract from the Me Too aspect.
Okay.
So, I mean, and I can tell you that if the trade would have made sense, it would have said, well, look, since you don't have the flight attendants, we need some additional protection. Let's do that. It wasn't. I mean, it was simply more.
Mm-hmm.
They got more out of the contract. They either reduced their hours, I don't recall which, but they got more out of it in exchange for removing, I mean, they sold us back the flight attendants. The real issue was there, as far as the lenders were concerned, is that it didn't matter whether the flight attendants were in or not, because what we were going to get out of the flight attendants was offset by the fact that we continued to take out. So what we were going to get in productivity, and plus the fact that there were going to be some wage increases put in their contract, was totally offset by the fact that, absent a contract, we were going to continue to withhold 18%. So, you know, we could argue with the lenders that that's a Mox Nix, no-brainer. I mean, it just really doesn't matter whether they're in or not, and they bought that. So it was on that basis that we went to the pilots, and the pilots, of course, said, well, yeah, we'll do it, but for something in exchange. We want to bargain something. Then the mechanics, we finished their negotiations, and they had we had a system for restoring wages through productivity. We had, and again, this has taken place over such a long period of time that the contract became somewhat of a crazy quilt. And then it had these fixed increases of 6%, 4, and 3 built into it. Charlie's contract didn't ratify. I mean, the first time around. And the pilot said, oh, all bets are off. I mean, we're out of this. And we said, wait a minute. I'll talk to Charlie. Now, Charlie called me on the night that the contract went down and said, I'm not calling you to ask you to give us more. I'm going to take that same damn contract back, and they will ratify it. I can deliver contracts. I'm not here to ask for sweeteners. I'm not here to ask for anything. I'm telling you that I'm going to take exactly that same contract back. And so we said to pilots, you know, hold your cards. It's not a bingo yet, because all Charlie really is saying is that he screwed up the process, or we screwed up the process, and we really were forcing him to get the thing ratified in a hurry, and that we forced the ball, as Bill is fond of saying, and lost it. And so we argued with the pilots that they weren't really out of the deal until Charlie felt he had really completed this process and then had it rejected or accepted. And they said, oh no, that's it, we're out, this is the end of it. And subsequently sued us on that point. So it was through Bill's, I guess, suggestion, and I think, you know, I don't think I agreed with this. We said to Charlie, you can't just take it back. You have to appear to go out and listen to what they objected to about the contract, and then come back and say, these are the things that can change and these aren't. So, and Bill suggested that he call his executive board together and have them come in. So it was our initiative that did that. And Charlie thought it was a good idea. So he had the executive board come in. He'd probably tell you he was going to do it anyhow, but he had the executive board come in. And Bill and I, and I'm not sure, John McDonald maybe, but I think maybe just Bill and I sat down with the board and we listened to him tell us why the damn thing didn't get ratified. And essentially there are a couple things. One of them was that the membership felt that in the drafting of the language, even though we improved some things, we eliminated some things that had been a long-standing practice. And it had to do with such trivia as taking vacation a day at a time and things like that. We had a policy of doing those things. We made some other changes in vacation scheduling, because we tried to flatten the vacation schedule. And they thought they lost something in the process when that wasn't the intent at all. So you could easily say, look, what we will do is add back language that reinforces that we're not changing it. So we basically wrote down what we had done before, then what had changed as a result. And that was about, I mean, that's the only example I know, but that was about the extent of the changes we made. Mm-hmm. But the real thing was to go through the process of appearing to listen to people, or of listening to people, not just appearing, but of listening to people and taking the time to take that back. And so with those tweaks, and that's all they were in the agreement, it went back out and was ratified. Well, pilots are still saying it's too late, you know, which, you know, then leads you to wonder about their sincerity in the thing. Were they really interested in having a deal, or were they now interested in coming back and trying to do better? So then that became a lawsuit, and of course we finally settled that out of court with some very, very horrendous payments. One, we agreed to take them back to 100% without any kind of improvement in productivity. And secondly, we agreed to match the IM increases even while bargaining was going on. So the pilots basically had their 100% wages back, and I think we agreed to cut hours too. Reduced their flying hours and had a 6% pay increase built in effective February 1, and a 4% effective January 187, and a 3% if they didn't reach an agreement. Probably the dumbest bargaining we've ever done, because obviously that set the floor, and what it was going to take to get an agreement after that was more of that. In fact, I think they did have another increase in it they claimed was due them because it came from another time and place, a 1.5%. So what the pilots ended up with is 100% restoration of wages, plus planned increases that would take place over time over the next 2 years. And of course, this did not make the I am too happy. I'm ahead of myself, because that's what we knew we were going to do with the pilots, and that was not yet obvious to the IAM. The IAM was fighting with us constantly over the value of productivity improvements. They were claiming that we were shorting them, that we weren't including projects that should have been, on and on. And every time every quarter we sat down, we had an argument, so I could see where that was going. In the meantime, we had a meeting with the non-contract steering committee. It was our first really big get-together with the senior officers of the company and the members of the employee involvement non-contract steering committee. This committee is now starting to blossom, and had been for some time, but is coming more into the fore. And it was there that people talked about, if we could only just get everyone back in and of course you have to recall we were making quite a bit of money in the first part of 1985. So Pan Am was on strike, United was on strike, and it looked like we were well ahead of our 2% goal and well on our way to sharing profits. So the non-contract people said, the single best thing we could do is just go ahead and take everyone back to salary of record. I mean, that would be a magnanimous gesture. It could be done without cost, because it would all come out of the profit sharing anyhow, so the expense of doing that would be and Frank was, I can tell you, inclined to tell them on the spot that he was willing to do that. He said he decided it could be done, and it ought to be done, and I think I'm just going to go ahead and tell him. And Joe and I said, look, if you do that, when we know we're sitting on this potential return to 100% with the pilots, depending on how this lawsuit settles and what kind of thing it takes to get the job done there, we know that potentially we could be taking them back. Here you are, ready to give this to the non-contract people, and yet we're supposed to hold the line with the IAM as far as the value of any future savings. And you just simply want them out of the picture from a productivity standpoint, no matter what. He said, I don't think they can earn more than 2.5% back of the total over the balance of this contract, and I just think we ought to hold the line on those, be very tough. And I think, quite frankly, they had a hard time getting, they would have had a hard time getting productivity projects that had a lot of value, because they were tougher and tougher to come by. But I think they still would have, over time, found them all. So here we were from an employee relations standpoint. We were ready to give so we were ready to gratuitously return salaried employees, non-contract employees, to full salary of record, and just wipe the slate clean. We were ready to do that to the pilots in return, with no productivity in return. So what we were saying as non-contract people is, look, we'll take on good faith that you'll go out and continue to work for productivity improvement. We were ready for no promise of increases in productivity. As a matter of fact, part of the deal would have been to reduce productivity on the part of pilots.
Yeah, okay.
Ready to return them to full pay because they'd always wonderfully supported this company. And we were then be in position where we had to literally hold the line with the IAM and make them account for every penny. And I thought we were heading for an employee relations disaster. So Joe and I said to Frank, look, why don't you let us see if we can make a different deal with Charlie. And we went over to Charlie and said, look, Charlie, first of all, our argument was, I guess, you guys have done us in anyhow, because you have a going out wage if you add full wage restoration to the pay increases you have scheduled. You add those two together, you've got a going out wage that's very close to $20 an hour. Now, we wouldn't be too PO'd over that if you hadn't in fact settled with everyone else for something, almost $1 an hour under that. So where we were, I think, at about $19.44, everyone else was down in the $18 range and wasn't paying nearly those kind of pay increases over the life of their agreement. Same union. I said, we settled. It should have set a pattern, but you guys can't even enforce a pattern. So the fact is, you've almost ensured our demise by settling too rich by comparison. I mean, you have settled no agreement since, and so you didn't enforce the settlement. You didn't maintain the discipline within your own organization. And what I had in mind most was U.S. Air, because Bill Sherry, the IAM, had settled with U.S. Air similar pay increases, but much lower pay going up. Mm-hmm. So we argued that. And we said, we're going to continue to fight over productivity, the value of it and everything else. You've asked on several occasions for us just to tell you that it will come back, and then you'll just shut up and play the game. So what we're now saying is we are willing to take it back, the full 18%, if you'll cancel initially, if you'll just forget about any wage increases over the life of the agreement, and which would then have made us very competitive from that standpoint. Initially, he thought that was a good idea, but as he looked at us compared to other carriers and so on, other majors, he did not want to go from being the highest paid to being the lowest paid. So then came the discussion. And after a lot of give and take, where we finally ended up is taking that 6% February increase, cutting it in half and moving it to June. So it became 3, scheduled for June 1. We cut the January one in half from 4 to 2 and left the 3% in place, which gave us a going out pay of about $18.44, I think it may be $18.70, in that neighborhood, in the mid-18, which probably wasn't too bad, and which really was a very dramatic thing to pull off with the IM. First of all, they never open agreements in the middle of agreements, and they never negotiate downward. And so now, maybe this is the nature of a set the record straight thing. We go around in our organizing campaign, our counter-organizing campaign, saying we just made a big mistake with the IAM when we renegotiated that contract. The fact is, there are a whole lot of people sat right in this room who are awful damn willing to settle for a lot more. And it was Joe and I who said, no, let's hold the line. We think we can get it for this. And that reduction in exchange for the restoration came very quickly, was ratified very quickly by the membership, and reduced the cost of this agreement dramatically.
How recently was that now?
That was 1985. That was the end of 1985.
Okay.
We no sooner had that damn thing negotiated, and then everything went to hell. So what looked like was 1 month we were predicting a $2,000 or $3,000 or $1,000 payoff on profit sharing. We had that became a loss, became nothing, and then became a loss, and then and so on. So the whole business turned about the last quarter of 1985.
85, okay.
Now Wayne, I have to say this, Wayne Yeoman was forecasting that earlier than that, saying, you know, we shouldn't be making this deal. I mean, he was talking about, I say the room was full of people who thought we ought to make the deal with the machinists. Wayne was saying, I'm not sure we can afford to do it. And we said, what are the alternatives? Because it's going to be less, Wayne. And his position was that the business was going to turn sour, and that it was going to turn down, and we were going to be losing money. So he was right. I mean, he's the financial guy, and he was right. The fact is that had we not done it, where we would be today is we'd be sitting on a contract that paid a lot more, still be fighting over the value of productivity. Well, probably be out of business where we'd be today. But it really became a very intricate kind of maneuver, as I said, knowing that we were at the time a breath away from taking salary employees back, about a half a breath away from settling with the pilots. We needed to move in and settle. Now, Jerry, I don't think there's 4 people in the company that know that sequence of events. I mean, Joe does. Charlie obviously doesn't. He doesn't know that we thought of returning salary employee wages before we ever sat down to talk to him about taking his back and getting something in exchange for it. But the fact is, those became pretty modest increases then, but the business simply couldn't even support those, as it turned out.
But it certainly it makes sense from a machinist's point of view that as you got into the tough negotiations in December and January and February, now getting into '86, that they were going to hold. They had a contract.
Yeah, they had 2 contracts, and it was then that Charlie began to talk about the irony of this whole thing. Is that, you know, here you were, you still didn't have a contract with the pilots, you still didn't have a contract with the flight attendants. He had negotiated and ratified 2 agreements. He had negotiated one, had it turned down, and took it back essentially in the same form and had it ratified. Came back and renegotiated and ratified that one, and they were still sitting there, hadn't done dick. And I can imagine, putting myself in his shoes, how he felt about it. Now, of course, there's another piece of it, and Charlie's a very ambitious guy, and he really did, I think, dream of running this airline. I don't think there's any doubt in anybody's mind about that. And so that was also part of the game. But if you look at it, what's very tough to deal with, because if you look at it in a straight labor relations setting, Charlie's been a pretty responsible person. It's the periphery stuff, you know, that's gotten him in trouble. But I mean, if you just, on a factual basis, go through the thing, I don't see, as I said, as a union leader, doing his job in representing employees and dealing on behalf of of his members with the company, I don't think he's been all that irresponsible. Now you add in the other things, and that takes a different tack, of course.
There you're referring to some of the publicity that's gone with it, and the
attack,
the support, the public relations picturing of as if it were a personality clash between he and Borman is another.
Yeah. Well, the total desire, I can tell you, Charlie really secretly thinks that he's the best qualified guy to run this airline. And at one time was going to show the world, including Europe, that co-determination really could work, that a union leader really could run a major corporation, a large corporation, and total dreams and delusions of grandeur, you know.
Does a lot of that come from Barber?
I don't know. We have an ongoing battle. I say that Barber is a Svengali that really leads Charlie around, and Charlie says, no, And as a matter of fact, he's almost defensive about it, because every time we get in a discussion, Charlie will say, Jack, I know how you feel about Randy and his influence on me. And I would have to tell you that I get ideas. Randy's able to write those down in very good form, very succinct fashion. And that's the reason he's valuable to me. But they're my ideas. They don't come from him. And I don't know where they start, to tell the truth.
It would be hard
You
to
know,
unravel.
Yeah, because it really is it's easy enough with someone with Charlie's personality to have him think that all the ideas are his own.
Mhm.
And I don't know, and they're so similar in their social responsibilities and business responsibility sense that I, it really doesn't matter whose idea it was, I guess, over time.
Mhm.
But Randy is an advisor and has been. Charlie hasn't changed a lot. When he was just downstairs, he's almost...
Just today, you mean?
Yeah,
Mhm.
Today, yeah. It was almost as if he said, I don't really have anything I want to talk about. I just thought I'd stop in and see what was going on. And almost a very lonely guy who I'm not sure hasn't been abandoned by his union. I've always thought that Charlie was like Icarus, and that eventually...
Like who?
Icarus, who fastened the feathers to his arms with wax and thought he would fly to the sun. And he got so close, the sun melted the wax, and of course he fell in the ocean. And I've always thought that that's probably that mythical character was more like Charlie than anyone. Or he was more like that person than anyone. He really had ambitions and became, in a sense, blinded by them. And while appearing to be a very humble guy.
You have certainly gotten to, one of your main tasks since you've been here is to deal with the machinists, and so you've got to know him quite well.
Yeah.
Across the table.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. There and aside too, because he really does confide, personal issues as well as business issues.
Did you believe that there in February, that kind of coming down to the wire, that Sunday evening when Eastern was sold, that Charlie would in effect open the contract, or as people were saying, come to the party?
Yeah, I wanted to
Or do you think he was already at the party?
I guess I wanted to believe that he would. I didn't believe he was, no. I did not believe he was at the party. I know that he had every reason to say someone else had to go first. I think had the pilots and the flight attendants stepped up to it on a timely basis, that he might have.
Mm-hmm.
But as it was, he was once again, in a sense, all alone, because they hadn't reached an agreement yet. They hadn't said that they would make the deal. And I don't know. I've never really tried to put myself in his shoes at night as to where he had been with those two groups before. Now, ironically enough, they had worked pretty close together through some of this, because when we first started this campaign, they tightened up the ranks. We told Charlie, Bill and I had a long session with Charlie, and I don't know if Bill's talked to you about it or not, but to say, Charlie, look, we're going to go into this, we're going to lose a lot of money, we're going to have to restructure wages and benefits. I don't know where you fall on that, but if you're smart, you'd stay out of the fight with the other two groups. They really do owe us something, owe you something, and stand back and then decide after that what you're going to do.
What was the timing of this conversation? I just want to know what year I'm trying to...
Well, it was either the end, again, this is either the end, it was when we first started talking about the 20% pay cut the reduction in vacation and the changes in work rules, some changes, and the modification of the health care plan.
Okay. Okay.
So whenever those discussions first started, when we first ran our publicity on that, I think that was near the end of 1985. So it was then that we had this conversation with Charlie and said, you can do what you want, but those people haven't really been friendly to you. But he just couldn't accept that. And he joined with the pilots and the flight attendants. And it was then the get rid of management kind of idea started, and all the other horrendous things they did really try to unseat this management group. So that then, of course, created a friction between he and Borman that was well publicized. And again, so going back to that faithful night, as they say, February 23rd, if I were in Charlie's shoes, I'm not sure how I would have acted. I'm being presented with the idea that two groups have essentially negotiated a new contract that provides for 20% pay cuts. I think in my own mind I've already given 5. I hadn't heard that before that night. But when the 6 became 3, the 4 became 2, Charlie viewed that as taking 5% out of a contract that he already had. I reminded him that we also gave him back 100%, which started off as 18 and worked its way back, 82 and worked its way back to 100, that there ought to be some credit for that. But the fact is, he, in his own mind, he thought he had given 5. That's how he reasoned to the 15 in Borman's head. I can tell you he still wanted to have included in that the 3-2-3 that he had planned. So it would have been a disaster anyhow, Jerry. Unless we had a clean 20% over today's wages for a long period of time, it would have just started the whole thing. So again, going back to the original question, was it predictable that he would have held the line? I would just say, I don't know, it would have been damn difficult for him to agree to 20%. Now, we had a lot of things going, First of all, we'd forced the bargaining to a head by convincing the National Mediation Board that they were going to put us on the clock. We had had a lot of conversations and dealings with the IAM and John Peter Paul and Wimpesinger. I think they had led Frank to believe that if everybody else was there, they would be there, that kind of thing. That's all horseshit, It's just, those things happened, but for us to believe that they were going to deliver just wasn't on.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think we really did. I think we hoped they would, but we hoped a combination of enough things would result in the IM coming to the party, but I don't. From a practical standpoint, I guess if you really think about it in the cold light of a new day, it wasn't going to happen.
Let's pause for a minute. We're near the end of this tape, so maybe if you could just point to stop, and maybe we can get some more time in the next day or so.
Okay, good.
Okay, thank you.